Ons is geskakel op GROOTplaas. Ons gas saam met ons vanoggend is professor Armanda Bastos. Sy is van die Universiteit van Pretoria af se Veterinary Tropical Disease Department. Professor, good morning and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So we know that foot and mouth disease has been a massive problem for farmers. It's spread to quite a few different provinces around the country. You guys are busy with some interesting research at the moment. What is the main aim of your research?
So the main aim of the research is to determine exactly where the risk is if you're sending cattle to slaughter. Keeping in mind that when we send cattle to slaughter, we've already taken a number of steps to reduce that risk substantially. And just to actually look in detail at the science that's guiding that policy. A lot of that science was actually done a long time ago. It was done on animals when they were in the viremic phase and shedding virus, whereas when we send cattle to slaughter, we actually only send cattle that have recovered from the disease, and then only 14 days after we're sure that they are fully recovered. So the viral levels are very, very low. The associated risk is also low, but we are applying policies that are based on studies actually done on viremic animals that were shedding virus. So it really is to look in critically at the guidelines, see if they are valid or not, and if they're not, to actually use the science to adjust.
So what, on the ground level, what has been the processes that have been put in place to make sure that the foot and mouth disease doesn't spread further?
So it's a combination. Primarily it's biosecurity. So the moment you know or you suspect that you have foot and mouth disease on your premises, all animal movement stops and quarantine is essentially instituted, so quarantine measures. Also additional biosecurity measures. So you really want to limit animal-to-animal spread. It is a respiratory virus, and when it gets into feedlots where you have thousands of animals, that becomes quite difficult to prevent that animal-to-animal spread, especially if the environmental conditions favour survival of the virus outside of the host. So primarily it's biosecurity. Vaccination also is crucial. The moment animals are vaccinated, even if they become exposed and are infected, the viral loads are much, much lower, and that's also one way that you can break that animal-to-animal transmission. So it's a combination of factors.
So why is foot and mouth disease still costing the red meat industry so much money?
Well, because of the impact that it has, especially in high production systems. So if you're thinking about feedlots and you're thinking about dairies, dairy cattle are particularly badly affected. They get mastitis. It's very severe lesions on the teats, in the mouth. And when you get to feedlot cattle, if it's really bad clinical FMD, then the entire surface of the tongue can actually fall off. It affects the hooves. Animals can't eat for a couple of days. They lose condition. All of that translates into an economic impact.
Now, looking at these animals that have recovered from foot and mouth disease, what are the current rules for those animals that have recovered?
So what we need to do, for example, if you're thinking about the slaughter policies, is you need to identify a day zero. And the day zero corresponds to the last animal displaying clinical signs of infection that has recovered, or it's the last day of vaccination, whichever of the two comes last. Once you've declared that day zero, you have to wait 14 days before you can send animals to slaughter. And then you have an option of two slaughter periods. You can either send them for what we refer to as early slaughter, which is day 15 to 41 post day zero, or you can send them for late slaughter, which is day 42, and those regulations apply up till 6 months. They're very harsh, just in terms of the amount of the carcass that you're actually having to dispose of. So in that early slaughter phase, the regulations require that all offal is discarded, head and tongue is discarded, hooves are discarded. The carcass needs to mature for 24 hours. So you need storage facilities to keep the carcasses cold for 24 hours. You then measure the pH. The pH has to drop below 6. And only those carcasses where you have that drop in pH will actually enter the system. But before they can, you need to debone and degland the entire carcass. That essentially means that the number of animals you can process is far less than what you'd normally be able to process. And it has a lot of knock-on effects. So many people, because of the losses associated with sending animals for early slaughter, plus disposal requirements, associated costs, they're opting not to do that. And that has a knock-on effect all the way down the feedlot chain. So then they're not buying animals to bring in. In any case, there are very strict regulations on site at feedlots as well. So the impact disseminates right through the value chain, hitting small and even communal farmers that act as source populations for feedlots.
Do you think some of these slaughter regulations that are in place at the moment are outdated?
They definitely are. So the moment you start looking at the science, and remember, it's a controlled animal disease, so we are following international regulations. But if you start digging into the science that is guiding the regulations, you realize that some of it is quite old and it's outdated, and things have moved along. We've put in many disease and risk mitigation strategies to try and limit the risk as much as we can before we send animals to slaughter. And I don't think the regulations have kept up. So that is the whole point of the study, is to really ask the question, where is the risk if you're sending animals for early slaughter at day 15 post day 0? That's when you have the highest risk of infection.
Professor, we'll be back with you in a second. There's Professor Armanda Bastos, sy's van die Universiteit van Pretoria. Ons gesels 'n bietjie oor die uitbreek van die foot and mouth disease wat hulle nou 'n nuwe studie op het. Nou is tyd vir jou grootplaas kalender. Ons is geskakel op Grootplaas en ons gaan saam met ons in die ateljee vanoggend Professor Armanda Bastos van die Universiteit van Pretoria om te gesels oor bek-en-klouseer. Professor, so just before the break, we spoke about outdated regulations when it comes to slaughter, but how much meat is currently being wasted because of the blanket restrictions that are outdated?
So it's a substantial amount, especially the early slaughter, because it's the head, it's the entire head and tongue, plus all of the organs, plus feet. And then obviously the deboning adds just that additional time delay as well as labour cost, and has impacts. So they estimate, I mean, for early slaughter, the loss associated with what we refer to as the fifth quarter, all those parts that need to either be treated or discarded, ranges probably in the region of 1,500 rand per carcass.
Now, the one question that a lot of people have is recovered cattle. Can they still carry the virus, and why is this, a question that people need to ask?
So that is actually the biggest reason why we have all of these regulations. When cattle recover from foot-and-mouth disease, there's always a proportion of cattle that will become persistently infected, and the virus will persist, and it's at very low levels, but primarily in the oropharyngeal region. So that is why the head is condemned. The science regarding the actual risk that carriers pose, we haven't been able to demonstrate that carriers transmit to cattle in contact. But that risk is just felt to be far too great to ignore. So when cattle go to slaughter, because you cannot determine how many cattle become carriers, you make the assumption that all cattle are carriers. And that means, for example, we know that between 20 to 60%, in broad terms, of animals that have recovered will be carriers. The remainder would have cleared it entirely. But imagine you're sitting at the bottom end of the range and only 20% are carriers. That essentially means that all of those animals going for early slaughter, although it's only 20%, the entire batch is treated as if they are carriers, and everything is basically being destroyed or having to be treated before it can actually move on.
So foot-and-mouth disease is not something new to our farmers, our cattle farmers, but it feels specifically like the last season it's been worse than it has been. Is there any contributing factors to why this season's been a lot more hectic?
I think there probably are a lot of contributing factors, but it didn't start recently. I think this has sort of been building up over a number of years. Historically, we produced our own vaccines. Our vaccines were very well matched to the field strains in circulation, and we did that up until 2006. From 2006 onwards, we started outsourcing and bringing in vaccine from the Botswana Vaccine Institute. And the vaccines, or in that, although it's a trivalent, so it matches the serotypes in the country, the matching to our circulating strains is not as good. So historically, we managed just through vaccination and control measures to restrict foot and mouth disease to the area of the northeastern part of the country where you have persistently infected African buffalo, with a few maybe sporadic outbreaks occurring, but really nothing on the scale we're seeing now. But that has changed substantially, and it's probably been in the last 6 years that we've seen this outbreaks outside of the controlled area, and more animals being affected. And obviously the vaccine availability has been a major constraint as well. But animal movement and uncontrolled animal movement, that is probably one of the biggest drivers. And being able to detect the virus, because animals can shed the virus in the very early phase when they don't have any clinical signs of infection.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time this morning, and thank you for the research that you guys are doing. We'd love to have you back at some stage when there's some more breakthroughs, hopefully, and we get to the bottom of this foot and mouth disease thing. But dit is ons gas vanoggend op GROOTplaas, Professor Armanda Bastos. Sy is van die Universiteit van Pretoria om te gesels oor die bek-en-klouseer en natuurlik die navorsing wat hulle doen by die universiteit. Dis al wat vir ons tyd het vir vanoggend. So hoop jy het lekker saam met ons gekuier en ons sien mekaar weer môreoggend.